Hello and welcome to this IT Pro webinar presented in association with Cloudflare. Today we'll be talking about web performance, including how technologies like JavaScript affect page load times and how the standards the web is built on, like HTML5 and HTTPS, will affect the development of the web going forward. My name is Adam Shepherd. I'm the Reviews and Community Editor for IT Pro, and I will be moderating this discussion. I'm joined by Patrick Meenan from Cloudflare. Patrick is a senior software engineer and has had a near 30-year career in web development, including roles at pioneering companies like AOL and Google. Patrick, how has the web changed since you've been working in it?
Wow. To some extent, a lot of it's the same. You're still serving content. You still have HTML. The basics are still very similar. I'd just say there's a lot more. Rich media on dial-up? No, that was never a thing. Images, text, a lot of the same. JavaScript is going crazy. You couldn't build rich applications back in the day. But probably to me, the biggest change is the disparity between sort of the low end and the high end of connections. Back in the day, it used to be maybe 2400 baud to 56K. Okay, so you've got like maybe an order of magnitude at most. Now you've got almost the same low end still on mobile, but you've got the gigabit connections at home, and you have to try and solve the solutions on a much wider scale. So more of everything, I guess, is what it comes down to.
Interesting. I'm also joined by one of Cloudflare's performance engineers, Cornel Leszczynski. Cornel is an image compression specialist who helped develop the PNG Quant2 compression algorithm and also worked on developing the HTML5 standard. Cornel, how important is rich media to the world of the modern web?
Absolutely essential for everything from your meme images to e-commerce.
Excellent. As a reminder, we will also be accepting audience questions, which we will be discussing and answering at the end. You can submit those via the form on the interactive dashboard. So let's dive in, and let's start with the basics, first of all. Why should companies worry about improving their web performance in the first place?
We've got like decades of data at this point that shows there's like a direct correlation between the user experience and how quickly the site is and how engaged they are with the content with the site. I've sort of equated it over the last few years as people sort of have a time budget for what they can do online. And you have, like, let's say you're on the train or you're commuting to work or you're waiting for an appointment or something. You have 10 minutes to do whatever you're going to do online. And the faster the content is, the more you can do. And so we're not getting more users. There's so many people in the world, and growing the engagement is a whole lot easier than growing the user base. And so performance is a really good way to do that. And it's competitive, right? If your site or your competitor's site gets a lot faster and yours starts feeling slow, it starts feeling old and not as new anymore. And so there's a whole lot of different aspects to it, but at the end of the day, it pretty much goes directly to the bottom line.
Okay. Cornel, what do you think?
I agree with Pat. It's a quality factor of your website. People instinctively feel when your website is slow, and then it starts to feel like work, like a chore, and they won't come back.
What about applications? Is that also something that companies need to be worried about in terms of web performance? Because most companies, when they hear web performance, they think of web pages and their actual browser-based website. Do applications factor into it at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know that there's even a clear distinction between websites and applications anymore. Just about every static website anymore is an application to some extent. But the performance matters across the board. It's absolutely critical. Gmail, for example, it's one of the biggest web applications out there. But it's absolutely performance critical to get to your inbox, to get to your content. There's really no difference between navigating through the steps of an application or the tasks that you need to achieve to do whatever you're going to do, versus navigating through different pages of a content site. It all comes down to the user navigation journey and letting them complete that almost effortlessly.
Speaking of which, what are the main factors that influence web performance in the first place? Cornell, I believe this is something you've worked a lot in previously.
Yes. In general, it's just more of everything slows down your website. So when you're building a site, you're starting with a blank slate. That is the fastest that can be. And whatever you add on top of that, it's the extra cost in performance. These days, it's usually JavaScript, and especially third-party scripts that are outside of your control, and they might be really, really slow in pulling a lot of resources on your website.
Okay, so when we're talking about JavaScript running on websites, what does that look like in terms of the actual user experience? What is that powering in terms of the services that end users are actually consuming?
The thing is, users mostly don't see the worst ones, because the worst offenders might be things like tracking scripts, some kind of analytics, or your frameworks that you've used to build the website, which is not end user feature, it's just a tool for you, but the users are paying the cost for it.
Okay, so most of the impact is actually behind the scenes stuff then.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, you were mentioning applications, and how I mentioned sort of a lot of static content nowadays is applications. React, for example, it's one of the really hot ones. That's sort of the framework for building the application, and you end up seeing a whole lot of static content sites where you navigate across several different pages. But at the end of the day, it's a big React application or something like that. And you send down all of the JavaScript code down to the browser, which then executes it, pulls in a whole bunch of API calls, builds some content, and eventually generates HTML and a DOM that the browser then renders. Whereas sort of if you're just serving content to the users, the old school way to do it is, you do all that work on the server, you generate it, and the browser has it to render. And so now you've got this extra step in there where it actually has to run the application before anything is visible to the user.
That's interesting. I wonder if you could maybe elaborate on that in terms of what impact do the tools that we as IT professionals use to build websites and applications, what impact do they have on performance? Are all web tools created equal, or?
Absolutely not. And I mean, it's absolutely critical to the web performance. It's a big sort of discussion between the developer experience and the user experience, where the developer experience is you make it easier for the developers to build things and make rich experiences, sometimes at the cost of the user experience. And you sort of need to balance those two. And sometimes it is worth the extra effort for the developers to have a less pleasant journey, we'll call it, for the end user to have an ultimately much better experience. And you need to sort of find that line that works well for your business. And it's not a clear line, because sometimes a good developer experience lets you iterate faster on your product, right? And maybe that is absolutely critical to building your business. And it is sort of a trade-off that you need to consciously make.
Who's the best person within the business to manage and control that balance? Because, I mean, we've heard quite often, particularly in engineering and development-focused companies, where the development side can often get carried away with developing for developing's sake. Is this the kind of situation where DevOps can play a big role?
I mean, honestly, I think it needs to be a combination of DevOps. I think senior engineering definitely should have the empathy, the broader picture, and be able to rein in the developing just to play with a new platform. For example, I want to learn React, so this is going to be a React project, right? And it'll look great on my resume. And you want to make sure that you're doing it for the right technical reasons and not for sort of your own personal reasons. If those line up, then all the better. But I do think it is the technical organization, whether that be DevOps or engineering, at least at the senior levels, to help keep and sort of guide those discussions. But that's not don't throw out the new technology and stay old school. You need to stay modern and figure out what the best way to build the platform that you want for your business is.
It's a problem that cuts across the entire organization. Stakeholders might want to add more features to the site, add more tracking, utilities, analytics, and so on, which have a cost and performance. So they might be seeing utility of the things they want to add, but they don't see the cost. So you have to be measuring cost of your site. There are many tools to benchmark your site, to compare performance of your site against your competitors, so you know what's your performance budget, how much you can afford to slow down your website to add more code, add more features, and when you have to start optimizing. And for developers, it's really difficult to say no to adding just one more thing to the website. So if you have a set budget, then it gives developers ability to say, I cannot add this because this is slow, and we agreed we're not going to make it slow.
And by having a budget, it's also critical to, every remarketing tag, for example, that gets added to a page, the person asking for it always has a business justification that it's going to double or triple the volume. And if all of those really did double or triple the volume of traffic, there would be no money left in the world. But by having a performance budget cost associated with those, you can actually start holding accountability, right? It's like, okay, at the end of the day, that cost us half a second to start render, which costs us this much money. How much actual money came in as a result of adding it, and do we need to undo that when it is no longer profitable, for example, or the budget trade-off is no longer worth it?
You mentioned performance budget. I'd just like to kind of dive into that a little bit, because that's an interesting concept. When you say performance budget, is that in terms of the financial investment behind it, or is that in terms of performance headroom and the amount of code and scripts that you have running on your page, or a mix of the two?
Performance budget is a technical concept. It's usually time it takes to load your website on a certain device connection type, or more specifically, just amount of JavaScript and other resources that you agree to have on your site. It's an arbitrary limit, but you have to have some limit.
And that's something that needs to be agreed by all the stakeholders within the business, right?
Yes, it might evolve as your website grows, as your requirements grow, but yes, you need everybody on board with this.
And then usually it feeds into your tooling, where you set up as part of your continuous integration pipeline or whatever. You have the performance budget set up in there so that either it breaks the builds or it warns the builds when you inadvertently add like a library that all of a sudden added 2 megs of JavaScript before render or something. And so you can at least get the feedback that, okay, we crossed the threshold, go back to the business. Is what we're doing worth the fact that we busted the budget, and do we need to reevaluate what the budgets are? And sort of, it helps prevent sort of the creep, because if you don't keep your eyes on sort of the construction of your site and the performance of the site, we have seen time and time again, it just creeps. You get incrementally another 5K here, another 10K here, and a year later, all of a sudden, you've got 20 megs of JavaScript on your site, and you have no idea where it came from. And so just try and get some controls around that.
On that note, is there a kind of set, and of course this will differ for every site naturally, but is there a kind of ballpark quantity of JavaScript that companies should be aiming for in terms of what not to exceed?
0? I mean, controversial, but it's progressive enhancement, right? It's sort of the old school model of, if at all possible, all of your content and what the user consumes should be HTML, the layout should be CSS, styles, and then the JavaScript is progressive enhancement of the content. That falls apart a bit when you go to applications that actually are all JavaScript. But really, if you start from that mindset, then it's like, okay, what am I adding by adding any JavaScript at all? And sort of take it back from there. At least my simplistic perspective, but that's probably jaded coming from dial-up, right?
Connor, as someone who worked on the development of HTML5 and has quite a strong background in JavaScript. What's your view? Do you share Patrick's view of kind of no JavaScript as the ideal?
I wouldn't say absolutely no JavaScript because there are small, nice things that you can do with it. But I think that I don't want to get into details, but on the big picture, I think the JavaScript community loves shiny new things, and it's usually easy to sell. Just add up this new library, new framework, and your website will be great. And the old simple HTML doesn't seem to be so nice and shiny anymore, but it actually works the best. You cannot beat browsers at their own game, and whatever you send to the browser, they'll render HTML first, CSS, then they'll run JavaScript. So whatever you do in JavaScript, you're starting from the worst position from the onset. So sticking to old school content available in the browsers immediately is usually a really good solution.
So what's the future of JavaScript going forward? Is it going to be phased out at some point, or will it be around forever?
It'll be around forever. JavaScript is growing in capabilities, and some browser vendors imagine web browsers to take over as the operating system where you run all of your applications. So JavaScript is getting powerful. We just have to be careful not to overuse it. If you're creating a software for writing documents or presentations or something like that, you'll need JavaScript. If you're creating a brochure for your restaurant, you don't need any huge framework for this. You just need to have good content.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned basically like Chromebooks, for example, are a browser, right? And that runs all your applications, image editing, everything else. You sort of see the web evolving in that general direction. The JavaScript virtual machine, even if it's not necessarily the JavaScript language, is sort of powering WASM and the big uprising there, where you have a whole bunch of native code being able to compile and run within sort of the browser sandbox and the security sandbox. And so it's kind of an interesting mix where you have the browser as the platform these days.
Okay. What's the role of standards like HTML5 in all of this? Because browser companies in particular have been pushing technologies like HTML5 forward. Are they going to outpace JavaScript adoption? Have they already?
I think they go hand in hand. I mean, for the most part, the browser vendors, for the most part, they implement new things that developers need to build some of these applications, whether it be on the HTML side or on the JavaScript side. I think you see generally JavaScript evolves faster than HTML because you don't want to sort of completely change the markup, the DOM, as much as possible. You want to try and keep that to be a stable environment. And we have sort of the backward compatibility angle to it as well. But the browser vendors tend to also be the companies that have large applications that they need to build. And so they've got the dev teams that they work with go, okay, what features are missing for you to be able to build this image editor or build this offline app within the browser? Okay, how do we solve that in a forward-looking way that we're not building it just to solve this one problem, but that we can open up that class of things to the browser runtime, if you would. And then wherever it makes sense to put that in HTML5, in JavaScript, somewhere in between with service workers and everything else in the whole processing model, they're basically looking at it as a platform overall. How do we evolve that to be a good platform for building the future?
Okay. Connor, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think Patrick already got it.
Excellent. Now we've talked a lot about JavaScript, a lot about HTML5. What impact do the languages that developers use have on the future of the ecosystem? Because the skills gap is something that is a concern for the wider IT industry across a whole range of sectors, security being a particular one. Are there enough developers that have the requisite language skills to kind of propel the web to where it needs to go?
The web is growing faster than we can train developers, so this is always a problem. On the other hand, developers just need to continuously learn new things. That's so far the nature of the entire tech industry. Things change. You cannot just learn one thing and run with it forever. But you don't always have to be at the absolute cutting edge of today's most fashionable utility or framework or language. Some concepts that are core to the web, HTML, CSS, a lot of basic JavaScript API, haven't changed in years, and you can still use them to deliver a very good website.
And I mean, as developers, I wouldn't get too hung up on the language specifically. There are very few generic paradigms that sort of underline everything. You've got procedural versus functional, and sort of I spend half of my time just, okay, how do I do printf in whatever language I'm looking at right now? And the actual underlying language that you use to build whatever you're going to be building, it's a tool. And developers can generally move between them fairly fluidly. It might be a little painful for a few weeks or so as they're sort of coming up and spending half their time on the docs of, okay, in this language, how do you do X? But the how do you do X is sort of the critical part. And as long as we have developers coming on board that are sort of good at the basics, good at the foundational, and aren't I only work in this one language, this is my sandbox. And for the most part, most developers are fairly comfortable moving around as needed.
Okay. I'd like to move on now to talking about some of the more practical elements to web development and how site administrators can actually improve their page performance and their application performance. What are some of the most common traps that sites and site admins can fall into that can affect performance?
I mean, Cornell already touched on third parties a little bit, but a lot of it, so I spend most of my time looking at start render is one of the key metrics we kind of look at in the web in general. It's like, how long is the user staring at a blank screen? And a lot of what goes into that is sort of, what are all of the blocking things in the head of the document that prevent the browser from being able to render the content? And that ends up being tag managers, A/B testing, a lot of the third-party scripts that sort of get injected at the beginning of the document. And that's sort of one of the easy traps to fall into is let me just add one more script up to the head of the document. Hopefully you can make it async, but if you're not keeping an eye on those things, if you're not testing sort of the production version of your site where you are running the A/B tests and where you are running the tag manager with the production configuration, you're not seeing sort of what the experience is that you're actually shipping to all of the users. And so that's the easiest place to get derailed, and the place I most often see sites getting derailed still to this day.
Because developers are testing in quote unquote clean environments rather than their production environments.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a little unfortunate, but most of the developers I talk to are the ones that are really upset about advertising and are the ones that are diehard ad block users. And it's like, seriously, if your site's not good enough for you to use without an ad blocker, why are you shipping it to customers? We need to have the empathy. We need to be able to consume the sites, the web, the way it's published. And we need to run our production site and test our production site in dev the way it is actually running in production, with all of the ads, with all of the tags, with the A/B testing platform, so that we sort of understand what the costs of these decisions are and we're building correctly for them.
Yes, and you have to test with realistic connection speeds and realistic devices. Your developers, your stakeholders are probably using your office Wi-Fi and have server locally, and it's going to be super fast. But your users are going to be on mobile connections. They'll have perhaps cheap phones that are not that fast as your latest iPhone. And they might struggle because there might be orders of magnitude difference in performance of a device and connection that they're using.
Yeah, it's actually the original reason I built Webpagetest in the first place was when I was at AOL. our offices were literally across the street from the data center that ran our servers. And we had really nice, fast Ethernet connections to everything. Back in the day, all of the developers were using Firefox because Firebug was the main way to debug anything. But all of our users were on dial-up with IE. And the empathy gap there was huge. It was like, no, it's fast. I don't know what you're talking about. It's like, yeah, it's fast on your Ethernet connection across the street, but for our users that are dialing up, it's nowhere near fast. And so, yeah, I mean, being able to test and understand what the real user experience is and of your site is critical.
I feel like there's occasionally a slight misunderstanding among users specifically that if it's web-based content, then because it's hosted by somebody else, that the speed and quality of their device shouldn't matter a huge amount. Is that true?
That is not true. The web has grown to the point where we're doing so much client-side that the performance of the device matters a lot.
I mean, you were talking about the applications and the gap between content and applications. If we were serving just static HTML with very little rich media, maybe it would matter less. But the difference between the latest iPhone processors and sort of the entry-level Android phones going for $20, it's several orders of magnitude difference in performance in the code they can run. And what you're running in your dev environment on your iPhone, for example, where it loads and runs the code in maybe 2 seconds or whatever, that could actually take several minutes on a low-end Android device. And the difference is that big and that painful. And that's why you sort of see the Google DevRel teams pushing test on low-end Android devices. You will be shocked. It is a very painful experience.
Speaking of rich media and images, what kind of role do they play in page performance? Cornell, I know this is an area that you specialize in. Just how much of an impact can they have on the performance of your site if not properly optimized?
On a typical website, images take 2/3 of the bandwidth, which might get costly on websites for users who are paying for their mobile connections. Even if images themselves aren't blocking the page functionality, just the fact that the browser has to download so much data might delay loading of more critical resources on the page.
Is there any way to kind of optimize your images for lower bandwidth connections?
Yes, there are two things you have to keep in mind. One is delivering images with the right quality and right format. An easy mistake is to just take image straight out of the digital camera or save with your favorite graphics program with super high quality, because why not? Well, the cost in file size for the quality grows exponentially as you increase the quality. So you might accidentally generate a huge file that will just slow everything down. So you have to set the lowest image quality that you can find acceptable, and this will significantly reduce file size. Another thing you have to pay attention to is dimensions of your images. The screen sizes can vary a lot, like from 400 pixels to 4,000 pixels, from mobile to large desktops. So there is no single image size that fits all the screens properly without wasting any data. So you might want to look into responsive images. That's the way to deliver image at the right size to the right device. So the device only loads only the pixels that it needs to display on its own screen.
And my favorite sort of historical stories of looking at websites and images in particular, the metadata with some of these photo editing programs that when you just save instead of save for web, for example, we had a lot of cases where the thumbnails on the content page were thumbnail images that had embedded thumbnail images in them from the software that you were using to save it, and the embedded thumbnail was actually larger in bytes than the thumbnail image itself. So the metadata embedded in the image was larger than the actual image content shown to the users, which is just hysterically sad on so many different levels. But that's, unfortunately, it's a very common problem. I'd say I wouldn't be surprised if at least half of the images being delivered today are not either the right resolution, the right compression, the right format, or have metadata in them. And it's almost a platform problem to solve, because if you leave it to users uploading the images, they will get it wrong. The publishing systems, the publishing platforms need to sort of do all of this automatically for them.
Taking as much of the guesswork as possible out for the actual users.
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely has to. And with the responsive images, for example, with the multitude of device resolutions and everything else that's out there, you really need an automated way to generate all of those automatically. You're not going to have editors hand cutting 50 different sizes of images and doing all of the responsive image picture elements in the HTML for the 50 different layout breakpoints and everything else. We are at the point where there's so much variation these days, it all does have to be built into the platforms and automated.
What role do responsive websites have to play? Should there be a future for non-responsive websites?
There's a very, very tiny future. I mean, it's such a sliver, it's not even funny. Mobile is where it's all at, right? That's where the growth of the users, that's where the bulk of traffic is anymore. And going between even mobile devices, landscape, and to desktop, you really have no choice but to be responsive. That tiny sliver that I said maybe, like Webpagetest is still not a responsive site, because the vast majority of users are developers on large workstations building sites, maybe some content editing tools and things like that, where it may not make sense to have a responsive version on the phone, but we are at the point sort of where you need a solution that will work on the phones, because there's going to be large portions of the market where that is their only internet access, right? They don't have desktop machines, they don't have laptops. It is all on phones.
What impact do responsive sites, or rather, what impact does making your site responsive have on performance, positive or negative?
It usually doesn't have a big impact on performance, because it's not any extra you add, it's just the way you build it. So if you build it to be responsive from the onset, you're probably doing it right, and it'll be fine.
Okay. But relative to a non-responsive version of the same content, if it's going to look good on a high-resolution screen, then the responsive version is going to be a whole lot faster on a lower resolution screen, because you're not serving the same huge resolution images to a tiny 400 pixel wide screen, for example. That's the only way to have an appropriate performance for whatever device is browsing it. And it's probably worth considering more than just resolution when you're talking about performance. We're getting to the point where the bandwidth varies enough where sometimes we're looking at maybe we need to compress the images more for low-end connections and less for high-end connections, for example.
You mentioned kind of any site that's built as responsive from the ground up should be fine, which I would imagine most sites that are being built now are. But what about retrofitting your site to be responsive after the fact? How much development legwork does that take? Is there kind of a high time and financial investment required, or can it be done fairly easily?
It depends how your ambition is in delivering quality. You can get some basic responsive design fairly easy by modifying CSS and perhaps just hiding and removing content that you think is not essential. But it will be a so-so result. So sometimes you might need to change front end of your site more significantly. Many websites are divided between the front end that lays out the content and the back end that manages and stores the content. So you might not need to change anything on the back end, but you may need to significantly change your front end.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely basic 2x, 3x screen resolution is almost a no-brainer and an in place. an actual responsive site that changes layout based on device and screen, that is going to be a platform kind of a rewrite, looking at what should the site, how should it scale, because it's not like there's a mobile form, a tablet form, and a desktop form. There is everything in between, and you need to figure out, okay, as someone's resizing a window basically, how does the layout need to change, and what should it look like, and how does it need to flow? And that's usually a rethinking of the layout and construction of the site. The actual content produced may not need to change, but how it gets laid out definitely is almost a rethink.
Yeah, and I would like to warn against trying to develop a separate mobile version of your website. If you're gonna undertake rewriting your website from scratch, once again, you can just start with responsive.
Okay. Just quickly, what is the kind of minimum page load time or maximum, page load time that companies should be aiming to get under? Is there a kind of generally accepted benchmark?
0. Approach 0, right? I mean, it's a toss-up. You have to sort of look at your own site and see what the ROI is, and see, okay, a common thing to do these days is to plot the conversion rate versus the performance. And the performance, it's easy to say the performance, but you need to sort of pick what metrics work well for your site, make it user experience focused metrics, like when does the hero image show up or something along those lines. But figure out, okay, how much gains are there if I reduce it by half a second more? What's the cost in engineering to reduce it by half a second more? And at what point does that ROI start to shift where it's incrementally too expensive to shift an extra 100 milliseconds for the gains that you're going to get? I will say one of the more interesting things to look at is look at the tail of your performance. Don't necessarily look at the median and how do I move the median. It's how do I pull in the 99th percentile of my user base, and the experience they're going to see is probably an order of magnitude slower than what the median is seeing. And if you can pull them in, you end up actually pulling in more users that you weren't having before because they were bailing, and you can pull in a wider user base. But by pulling in sort of the outlier experiences, you'll move everything. And those tend to be the easier and the more systematic problems to track down and fix.
Another way to look at it is your competitors. They are setting expectation for your users. So you want to be faster than the next best alternative. But it's good to set very ambitious low limit. So then your team will have a challenge to meet, and they'll rethink how they build it, what is non-essential on the website, what can be cut out, and deliver just what needs to be done.
Okay. In terms of looking at websites with a platform-based approach, should companies periodically be going back to the drawing board with their websites and web apps and examining whether or not they need to re-architect on a regular basis? Is this something they should kind of build into their development pipelines?
I think it's something they'll sort of achieve naturally, as over the years you bolt on a lot of stuff onto the site and you realize that at some point to get from A to B, it's just not feasible with the platform that you've assembled, and there's newer, better ways to do it. And at that point, you sort of need to weigh the costs of, okay, it's going to take us a 6-month hit on productivity and product cycles to get from here to there, but then we'll have much faster turnaround and actually be able to hit either the performance or the business targets or whatever they are. But it really does come down to sort of the cost benefit. At what point is it just a sunk cost in the old platform, and is there a newer, better way for looking forward to the future? And it will happen at some point. You can't just sort of take a platform from 10, 15 years ago and expect it to continue to perform as well as some of the newer platforms.
Okay. So let's move on now to talking about the future and where kind of web development is going, where web standards are going, and the impact that all of that is going to have on performance for actual administrators and developers. So I'd like to start off by talking about some of the browser companies like Google, companies like Firefox. They've been driving the agenda in many cases in terms of the adoption of, as I mentioned, technologies like HTML5 and rich media, standards like HTTPS. Is this going to continue to be the case going forward? These companies going to continue to set the pace, do you think?
The standardization feedback loop is the more users a browser vendor has, the more power they have to force through some standards. But mostly the browser vendors cooperate in something like what working group on what's going to be the next feature that they agree on. It's also largely driven by developer demand. Features that are keenly awaited by developers will probably get more support than just evolving the web for the sake of adding more stuff.
I will say, Google in particular, it was very helpful when they sort of started getting useful market share in the browser, in that they controlled both the browser end and the server end for a good percentage of internet traffic. And so they could start doing experimentation with the platform before standardizing. They didn't sort of have to go through the standard cycle and then hope servers picked it up and observe what the impacts were. They could get into the cycle of, okay, let's try something between our servers and the browser we're building, see what works, what sticks. And that's sort of how we got HTTP 2, for example, right? It started out as speedy. It evolved. They proved that it worked well, at least for the applications that they were serving, took it to the standards board with the data that they had and the field experience they had with it, and then the standards board sort of evolved it from there. And then as a web platform, we're taking it from that point and going, okay, now we're starting to leverage things like HTTP 2. I kind of akin it to the video game industry, where you have a platform like the Xbox that comes out, and the first launch games are, they're pretty, they're high titles, but they're not as good as the platform can do. And over the years, you get towards the end of a platform's life cycle, and the games get better and better because the developers learn how to extract the most out of the platform that they can. We're sort of at that stage with HTTP 2, for example, and we're sort of learning what are all the rough edges, how does it work well in production at the global internet scale, and feeding that into standards like HTTP 3, Quick, which are sort of coming along as well. And I think we're going to continue to see that evolution cycle where, because, Google to some extent, Microsoft now with Edge and their servers, we start seeing the case where we can actually experiment in production with new technologies and find ways to solve the problems, and then sort of evolve them as we have been. It's exciting times, really.
You mentioned HTTP 2. I'd like to dig into that a little bit, because HTTP 2 has been out for a couple of years now. What kind of adoption level is it at?
So HTTP 2 is tied part and parcel to HTTPS, not per spec technically, but in every practical deployment. The browsers will only do HTTP 2 over an HTTPS connection. So if you have HTTPS, the adoption of HTTP 2 is fairly high. I'd be surprised if it was less than the high 90s. The adoption of HTTPS has been growing as well with Google's push for secure web, search result impact. That always drives adoption of everything. So I think we're in really good position with HTTP 2 now for adoption. The technology still is a little shaky. Like I said, we're sort of still trying to figure out where all the rough edges are. How does it work well in production in live environments? And so we're sort of, I say we still got probably a good couple of years left of evolving how HTTP 2 is deployed before we've extracted the most we can out of it for performance.
Okay. Cornell, what about HTTP 3? What stage of development is that at? When can we expect it? Next couple of years or longer than that?
It's still experimental, but yes, we can expect it in the next couple of years. Some companies will help to push the forward, like Cloudflare, that we have a power to just flip a switch on for a large portion of the web and deploy protocols like this.
Okay.
I will caution just really quickly, HTTP 3 is not going to eclipse HTTP 2, for example. So HTTP 2 can largely replace HTTP 1 in place. Quick HTTP 3 is UDP based. There are going to be large portions of the web where it's going to be blocked or it just won't work. And so HTTP 2 and 3 will always coexist. So it's not, HTTP 2 is not going away because we have HTTP 3 coming out.
Right.
Okay.
We can expect some growing pains as the networks adjust to the new kind of traffic.
So what kind of benefits can we expect from HTTP 3 in terms of performance and functionality?
It's mainly tuned for mobile connections where there's packet loss, where connections can be interrupted. It's much more resilient to poor network conditions, and because many more users are using it now, the web on mobile, that's becoming a very important use case.
I'm really excited to see if we can pull off a zero RTT negotiation, if you would, the handshake for HTTP 3 quick. It's always been hit or miss on whether it can work, but on each new, so right now browsers tend to make dozens of connections for each web page that loads because of all of the third parties and first party content, and each one requires 2 or 3 round trips to be able to set up each one of those connections. One of the things Quick might bring, or HTTP 3 might bring, is the ability to bring that down to 0 round trips, which saves a whole lot of overhead in sort of the browsing, the shove as many bits down to the user as possible routine.
Okay. While we're on the subject of standards, are there any web standards, bar the ones we've talked about already, that are going to have a major impact on the future of the web?
So it's not quite at standards level yet. I'm excited for binAST, which is binary compiling of JavaScript, effectively, the parsing of JavaScript at least, pushing that off to the server. And instead of doing all of the parsing of text on the browsers, and like we mentioned, the big disparity between low-end Android and high-end iPhone, parsing of the JavaScript text and to create the tree before it's compiled down to code is one of the most expensive things to do, and we're sending more JavaScript. So one of the things that's being experimented with right now is doing the parsing on the server, sending down a parsed binary version of the JavaScript so the browser can tear through it really quickly and do the compilation. I'd optimistically love to see us even go a step further and compile everything on the server and send it down. But the more we can offload of the execution of JavaScript from the browser, the more we can make the experience sort of consistent across devices, from the low-end devices to the high-end devices. And odds are developers are going to suck up every bit of that performance that we give them, and it'll just be, twice as much code running, but you'll have that much more rich experiences that are coming. So that's definitely one I'm excited to see how it evolves and where we go from here.
Okay. Patrick?
Cornell.
I'm excited about AV1 video codec. It's a free-to-use, very efficient compression that I think will improve quality of video on the web, and might also be usable for images, significantly reducing bandwidth compared to all the formats that we have currently.
Okay. So in terms of performance gains, are there any kind of early benchmarks for what kind of level of improvement we can expect?
Yes, we can expect half the size for images and videos compared to the older generation of codecs that we have usable currently.
Okay, and will that translate directly to twice as fast, or are there kind of extra impediments?
Probably yes. Probably mostly will translate to twice the fast.
Or
to deliver
twice the resolution,
or yes, quite possibly
much better quality.
much better quality, and new features for this high-end screens like high dynamic range or deep color.
Okay, excellent. I'd like to move on to audience questions now.
Great.
So the first question is what the impact of 5G is going to be on web performance.
So for me, it's going to seem a little weird, but the thing I'm most excited about for 5G is fixed point wireless, point-to-point for homes. Especially in the US and rural America, we still have lots of areas that are not covered by cable connections. And so your choices are dial-up, maybe cell if you're lucky, or satellite, which has insane round-trip times, even though you have high bandwidth. And so being able to do a fixed point wireless distribution where you can do gigabit at a wide scale with 5G, even if it's to a fixed roof mount antenna, I think that's where the real excitement for me is for 5G, not so much on mobile devices. Mobile devices, we can't pull off the theoretical speeds of LTE these days are already over a gigabit. We're doing nothing to actually be able to suck all of that up. But being able to sort of get rid of some of that disparity between the low-end fixed point home connections and the high-end, and hopefully move everyone up towards, we have much lower round-trip latencies and much higher bandwidth is what has me excited about 5G.
Okay. Patrick, Cornell, do you have any thoughts?
I'm more skeptical about this because it's a huge cost for the networks, and they're still not keeping up even with existing technologies. So even though you might have a theoretically very fast connection between your phone and your tower, there might be physical limits to the signal propagation, or the operator might not even have enough bandwidth available on their back end, so you're not even benefiting fully from the connection that you can have.
Okay.
And there's the problem of a cost. A lot of plans come with quotas, so if you get a faster connection, you'll just use it up quicker.
That's always the risk, isn't it? That kind of code in particular will always expand to fill the bandwidth and the space that's allowed for it. Speaking of code, we have a question from Michelle. What about the performance of ASP.NET compared to JavaScript? What's the role there for ASP?
So you're not going to be running ASP.NET in the browser, I don't think. You might be able to run it in WASM or something like that, or I don't know if they're running it in the JavaScript VM.
ASP.NET is a framework for developing applications, and it comes with sort of pre-built widgets in a model that is kind of outdated and not very fast. So there's MVC.NET, which is a newer version, and there are many more frameworks that are more performant than the old ASP.
But that's all server-side framework, server-side code,
but
right?
the server-side code generates your client-side code as well.
Right, but it's generating HTML and JavaScript to run.
A lot of JavaScript.
A lot of JavaScript, but it's still,
yeah.
I mean, at a foundational level, .NET and JavaScript executing once they've JITted aren't going to be that much different. A lot of it's going to come down to developer experience versus user experience. If the developer team is used to building on Windows and ASP.NET, do the trade-off. See what is the end user experience that's generating in the browser. Because at the end of the day, that's what matters. That's what the users see. They're not going to see the performance of hopefully they're not going to see the performance of the code running on the server. If they are, and you have like sort of what we call a long time to first byte, that's the first problem you need to solve, because the browser can't do anything until it gets HTML. But once things are actually executing well, there tends to be almost no difference on the server side from the user experience on the performance. It's see what your platform actually spits out.
Okay. Moving on, we've got another question coming in. We've talked about common mistakes quite a lot, but what are any best practices? Is there anything that developers and site administrators absolutely should be putting in place to, achieve those positive outcomes?
Async JS. That's easily, if you can async a script, that's usually one of the biggest wins for performance, and that's one of the things that developers tend to get right. I would hesitate and be careful. I have seen people just throw async on all of their scripts and completely break the page because it changes the execution order of the scripts. But that's, almost every analytics script now, the default sample they give you is an async sample, which wasn't the case just a few years ago. And so I think that's definitely one of the easiest entry points and one of the most common things that people get right when they do get it right.
Mm.
And there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, like compression on HTTP level, use gzip or broadly. Minification of JavaScript and CSS can improve compression a little bit more on top of that. And image optimization, there are many tools you can use to compress, optimize, and remove expensive metadata. And these are basics that you can automatically apply to entire sites and get some baseline level of performance.
Okay, so kind of easy, quick fixes, relatively speaking, to boost performance in the short term. Excellent. So we've talked a lot about kind of page load times and time to first byte and all of those elements of user experience, but user experience is a lot broader than that. It encompasses stuff like design and layout and other factors. How importantly would you rank page performance in relation to those other elements of user experience in terms of the negative impact if it's poorly handled, or the positive, I suppose?
So I mean, for page performance, I'd say the first thing that's important is to make sure you're measuring the user experience of performance and not page load time, right? Because page load time is sort of it's not a relevant metric anymore. It's measuring a technical thing that doesn't mean anything to the user. Once you get and you're actually measuring the performance of the user experience, it is going to some extent be secondary to the user actually getting the content. If I need to buy a car, being able to see what the car is and what the options of the car are going to be much more important than the fact that it took 1 second versus 4 seconds to see that, right? But all else being equal, performance ends up being very important for the user experience. And if you've got something that's not, the user absolutely has to come to my site to get what they want, they have no other choice. If there's a competitor that can possibly give them the same information, performance ends up being a lot more important. It's hard to say a generic answer, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. It has to work. First, there has to be content. But if you look at websites like Craigslist or Amazon, they're pretty ugly, but they're fast and get the job done. So once you have the functionality and you have performance, you're good. It's better to err on the side of performance than on the side of having too flashy, too pretty experience on your website.
Okay, so focus on the performance and watch out for kind of over-designing in terms of the infrastructure of the page and the graphics and all of the scripts and applets and whatnot that make the fancy stuff happen.
Yes, well, you have to have some level of design for your website to seem trustworthy and to be clear and usable, but don't go over the top. Once you've got the basics, you should probably focus on performance.
Okay. Say I'm an admin and I want to optimize an underperforming website or web application. What are the first things I should look at? We've covered some of them, such as third-party tags, the top of page tags, and the kind of synchronization of the JavaScript. But are there any other foundational elements that I should make particular note of?
I mean, there's sort of 2 steps in it for me. The first step is understand what your current performance is. Either if you have your own real user monitoring RUM or Chrome user experience or something like that to show you what's the distribution of the actual user experiences. And then load it up in something like Webpagetest or DevTools and just dig deep into, okay, what is causing that user experience. I try and stay away from general guidelines, and it's look at the waterfall, look at the film strip, and see what's causing the film strip to load as slowly as it is, and what are the things that are blocking it from rendering, and go from there. They may be A/B testing, they may be tags, they may be your framework, they may be client-rendered JavaScript versus server-rendered HTML. It's going to differ every time, but the foundational tooling is pretty much the same. For me, it's always look at the film strip and waterfall once you understand sort of, am I testing something that's representative of what the users are seeing?
Okay. Cornell, what do you think?
Yes, absolutely have to measure first. Webpagetest is a great tool for that. Performance timeline built into developer tools is good as well. If you don't know where to start, you might try Google Lighthouse. That will give you some guidelines and directions what to optimize.
Excellent. We're almost out of time, unfortunately. Before we go, I'd like to get some final thoughts from each of you in terms of what is the one thing that developers and administrators should take away with them when thinking about how they approach the performance of their sites. Cornell, let's start with you.
The less is better. Like everything you add to your website will slow it down, so be careful what you add.
Excellent.
And it's a never-ending journey. I mean, it really will go on forever. It's not, we'll do a sprint, we'll be performant, and we'll be done. You need to monitor it, keep an eye on it over time, plan for it, build it into your processes. It is just sort of another thing that happens every cycle of everything you're doing.
Okay, excellent. Well, it's been a fascinating discussion. I'd like to thank you, gentlemen, both for taking the time to join me today. And I'd like to thank you, the audience, for taking the time as well. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have, but you can catch this webinar on demand afterwards if you'd like to share it with friends or colleagues. So thank you for joining us, and I will see you next time.